The Bible, God's good book. God's first book in his good book cuts through the inflation of human nonsense every time. From the very beginning of the Bible to the very end where Jesus is speaking, God attaches his name to a little man named Abraham. It ends up being God's story for us all. What Abraham learns, we need to learn too. And Genesis chapter 20 is a simple and lighthearted story that Abraham must pick up on and he must learn. And he does. He does learn it, and we need to learn it too. So, anyhow, what Abraham must learn in Genesis chapter 20 is be the blesser. Abraham and everybody, you and me, be the blesser. That's what God is teaching Abraham, and therefore that's what God is teaching us. Come on in, let's check it out together. Welcome to the Biblical Channel. Always glad somebody's here to listen to, just talking about God. Have a drink, talk about God. That should be the substance of our life because it should make our life really good. That's the expectation that God has, is that when we read his book, we have a lot of fun and we get a lot out of it and we put it into our life, and it enables us to ring the chamois of success in this world. No matter whether you're rich or poor, because God defines success as, the hope that you have in him and the joy that you end up having with him, and the fun that you end up having with him. God is no fun sucker. The world we live in is filled with fun suckers, and God is here to help us ring the chamois of this life to the best of our ability. He gives us nothing but good stuff, and we got the good stuff going on right here. So anyhow, before we dive into Genesis chapter 20, we just simply read the text and then talk about it. And we're going to read the text this time, but without going any further, let's pray the way the Lord Jesus taught us how to pray. And that is, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who have sins against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. There's the rub. Well, Father, you are good. And may we have fun with this text in front of us and get a lot out of it, and maybe take it right into life as we know it. Anywho, here we go. And we're ready for Genesis chapter 20. I'm going to go ahead and read it. It's not that long, so we're going to read the whole thing. And it goes like this. Genesis chapter 20, verse 1. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister." And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, "Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, 'She's my sister'?" And she herself said, "He's my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this." And then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours." So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called his servants and told them all these things. And the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see that you did this thing?" Abraham said, "Mm, well, I did it because I thought there's no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This is the kindness you must do to me at every place to which we come. Say of me, he is my brother.' Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, 'Behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you.' To Sarah he said, 'Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated.' Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and the female servants that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife." End scene. Okay, well, it is a funny story, and it's very lighthearted, and we should, have that kind of eye and heart whenever we come into this story. Especially when we realize we just came out of chapter 19, which is about as dark and gloomy as it gets when it comes to stuff going on. Genesis chapter 19 is all about Sodom and Gomorrah. And if you haven't listened to that talk, get back here and listen to it. It's really good. And it gives you lots to think about. Abraham has some crucial lessons to learn about sex and judgment. But anyhow, we come into this passage, and it's very much intended to be a lot lighter hearted. But still, the same thing applies. We're still watching Abraham grow. Abraham must grow, and Abraham does grow. God is patient with Abraham. God is bringing Abraham closer and closer. I don't know that God's getting closer with Abraham, but Abraham certainly is getting closer to God, and Abraham is learning more and more. And of course, Sarah is too. But the spotlight seems to fall on Abraham, especially because Abraham has this kind of trick up his sleeve that he seems to be very proud of. And it adds to, humor to the story, because this is the second time. I can only assume that Abraham did this a few times, and that's why it makes it into the story for the second time. But Abraham had this trick up his sleeve that he must have been very proud of, and that was that, his wife technically was a half-sister. Now, don't get your nose out of joint, at this point in time, and the Ancient of Days. We are into history now. We just came out of prehistory, but the taboo of any kind of half sister relations has not been made clear. God will make that clear as time goes on with Israel, but here it's acceptable. But it also feeds into the story that Abraham is just a little man like you and me. He's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and that is what makes him a great guy for God's story. Any person who's not perfect is a great person ready for God's story. If you're perfect or see yourself as perfect, then you're never going to get the Bible, and you'll probably be really angry at everything it says. And I don't know what to tell you. But anyhow, if you're a bum like me, if you are dumb like me, if you are a redneck, or, just some sort of low life, man, you really do appreciate the meaning of life that comes from the Bible. Anyhow, the scene, causes you to say when you get to it, "Oh, not again, Abraham. Are you kidding me? You didn't learn the lesson the first time that you can trust God. You don't have to resort to these little tricks." So that's what makes the scene pretty humorous. Also, part of the tension that's going on in this story is that Sarah still has no baby. There's been a baby promised. It's been a decade since God called Abraham out of his own land, and he's been sojourning and, going through these motions of a friendship with God. But the one critical promise that God had made still hasn't happened, and Abraham and Sarah are so old at this point. Sarah is 90 years old, which is also part of the fun of the story. Sarah is still a looker. And the Bible is not playing games here about how good of a looker Sarah is, even though she's like 90 years old. And that's part of the great fun. Sarah is this looker, and when Abimelech, king of Gerar, sees her, he says, he finds out who she is, and he wants to bring her into his harem. Once again, God does not endorse polygamy, but he also can endure it. He can, live with it, although, every example of polygamy goes south or wrong. So I don't think that we should be rushing off saying, oh, yay, polygamy. Once again, look at chapter 19 when we did that last time. For a bigger discourse on all of this. But at 90, Sarah is still a catch, and that's great fun. And actually, Abimelech, clearly plans on having sex with her. He clearly plans on making her his wife. And as soon as he has sex with her, well, then he's going to be her husband, and now she's going to have two husbands. And we already saw how complicated that was for Abraham. Whenever Sarah came up with the idea to have sex with Hagar, the servant, so that they could have a child, thinking that they knew better than God. Again, lots of good, funny stuff going on here. And I would just say God is funny. I find God to be hilarious. I think God is much funnier than we are. I think that we're mean most of the time, and our humor, it lacks good plot development. And so God is not that way. God is pretty funny because he allows this scene to unfold. And, in the nick of time, before Abimelech does something that's detrimental to him, God meets up with Abimelech in a dream. And what makes this really funny is that Abimelech becomes the man who God is speaking to, and on speaking terms with God. And it's not Abraham. And in fact, both Abimelech and God are going to gang up on Abraham and say, what are you doing? Come on, man. This isn't, you almost caused a calamity in my life. And that is part of the lesson. Abraham is not to cause a calamity in anybody's life, and he is to be a blesser. But another thing about Abimelech that's very important to catch hold of here is that this is yet another non-elect. Non-elect. If you got some sort of Christian background, you got to pay attention to that word. This is a non-elect person, Abimelech, in the storyline that God seems to care a lot about. In fact, in this part of the story, God seems to care more for Abimelech, well, just as much for Abimelech as he does Abraham, and that is the God of the Bible. Never changes his tune. God is always concerned for both the elect and the non-elect. In fact, the only reason that God has an elect is so that the non-elect can be reached. And so Abimelech is a non-elect, and he is to be reached. We also see that Canaan is nowhere near being ready for judgment. And remember, God had told Abraham that he's not going to give Abraham himself this land of the Canaanites, because the sins of the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, all those ites, are just simply not complete yet. 400 years will go by. God specifically told Abraham that the sins of the Canaanites are just not ready, and we can see why. We got righteous men like Melchizedek, part of the Canaanite group. We've got righteous men like Abimelech. We've got righteous people that God has taken care of, and that's the way it goes. God always takes care of people. He is not quick on the trigger to judgment at all. In fact, he's super delayed because that's how kind he is, and that's the storyline that's building up here. So we can see very clearly why, Canaan is not near judgment, because there's lots of people that can be reached here. It'll take another 400 years for, Canaan to go completely sideways. They're already going sideways, but not in every place in Canaan. And, anyhow, the comical card really turns here because, Abimelech is a righteous man, and he proclaims this to God. He's like, oh, my Lord, I did not mean to do anything wrong here. I thought, I didn't know. I did not know this was another man's wife, and so that's the comical turn here, is that Abimelech really seems to be a righteous guy, and he's really, really concerned, and he's really, really afraid that he's gotten himself into trouble with God when God, speaks to him, and this is a good sign. And God, very gently says, ease up. I know where you're coming from here. I get the scene. I know what's going on here. It's Abraham's fault. But God doesn't let Abimelech really, off the hook here with Abraham, or, kind of encourage Abimelech to go beat up Abraham at all, because that's not God's ways. And he also makes it very clear to Abimelech. He said, now listen, the reason why you're not going to touch the reason why, I'm not going to do anything to you here is because, well, Abraham's a prophet. And what I want Abraham to do is to pray for you so that you will live. That's just kind of funny, that here's Abimelech. He's concerned that God's going to kill him, and God will kill him. And God says, if you don't return Sarah to Abraham, I'll kill you. You will die. Abimelech is horrified at this whole situation, but it's also very tender and sweet, because God says, yeah, you're going to return her because he's my guy. He's my prophet. And I want him to pray for you so that you will live. Talk about a precarious situation, right? I mean, now you're thinking, okay, well, I'll do my part, but now my hands are in Abraham's hands. Turns out he's in good hands, but you can't miss the tension of the story and, the fun-loving nature of the story as well. And so Abimelech, searches out Abraham right off the bat, and he's like, dude, what did you do? What was going on in your head? What you can just hear that. What, Abraham, you're killing me here. What did you see that you did this thing? And then Abraham's response is a bit of a dud, right? He's like, well, I did it because I thought that, well, there was no fear of God around here. Well, you can't blame Abraham, because Abraham just came off of the Sodom and Gomorrah scene. I suspect that, the Sodom and Gomorrah thing probably scared the, out of Abraham. He might have had to clean his underwear, a few times, thinking that, oh my. And that was part of the story in chapter 19. Abraham has to get a clear picture of the reality of God's judgment and how serious it is. And he also wanted Abraham to see how, sex makes people crazy, and sex has to be treated with care. Anyhow, once again, go back to go look at our talk on chapter 19 to get that. I guess it's kind of a commercial for it. Anyhow, so Abraham says, well, I didn't think there was any fear of God in this place. No, I thought you'd kill me for my wife. And then he says, oh, besides, I wasn't really lying. I was just telling you half-truth. She is technically, my half-sister. She is my wife. Yes. Okay. So in it all, though, I think one of the things that we need to develop in our brain is how the Bible works. And how the Bible works is that the Bible never pretends like it is the original source for all morality. Like nobody ever heard of, morality like the Bible talks about morality. The Bible talks about morality in a way that we actually all know. And that's the way God treats us, because we're all made in the image of God. In the image of God, God created us all. And hence, we should all know that if we do what is right, then we'll be accepted. That's the exact words that God had said to Cain before, Cain had killed his brother. He said, Cain, if you do right, you will be accepted. And that is the formula that we have to keep in mind. And also the formula is being reinforced here. Abimelech is a guy who is trying to do right. And God understands that. And God knows that. And when Abimelech is confronted with the special part of God's revelation of himself, namely Abraham, well, we see another part of God's revelation develop. The way that the chin-scratching scholars talk about this is that there is general revelation that is given to everybody, because everybody is made in the image of God. And because we're all made in the image of God, we intuitively know what is right and what is wrong. That's good, solid Bible teaching. That, we wake up every day, and if we don't know this, if we didn't learn it in 7th grade science class, we should. But the world is spinning right now at 1,100 miles an hour, and it's traveling around the sun at 236 miles an hour. That fact alone should just shock us into saying, "Dear God, where are you? I need to find you." Turns out God's not all that hard to find, but we sure do make it hard. But anyhow, general revelation is the kind of revelation that God gives to everybody, and God understands that. But then there's special revelation. And special revelation is the specific storyline that God himself is developing. And now that specific storyline is developing through Abraham. It's going to lead to the development of Israel. Israel's going to have a king, and Israel's going to fail as a nation, but they don't, because the true king of the world is going to come out of this nation. His name is Jesus Christ. This is called special revelation. This is what the Bible truly is, special revelation. And, God actually understands that the rest of the world around is not in the know about special revelation. And one of the key litmus tests of somebody who is savable, or somebody who God really cares about, is that when a non-elect person runs into God's special revelation, meaning that when somebody who just has general revelation runs into the special revelation of God, like Abimelech, they say, "Oh, I'm all in. I'm all in on this." And that's what we saw with Melchizedek, and that's now what we see going on with Abimelech as well. God will bless those. God will bless those who receive Abraham and God's special revelation. That special revelation is going to go the whole way to Jesus Christ. Anybody who receives the special revelation, guaranteed, you are going to be blessed by God. But also remember that God will curse those who curse God's special revelation. That's, the balance in the scales. Really, we get all butthurt and worried. Supposedly we're worried about all the people who didn't hear, about the special revelation. And I would say to you exactly what God would say to you, and that is, leave that up to God. God always does what is right. God understands, why people didn't get the special revelation, and he will judge them correctly and rightly and fairly, just like God does. But the real question is, what are you doing with God's special revelation? And if you are cursing that special revelation, mocking that special revelation, and saying, "Oh, I don't need that special revelation," that's not good. Well, anyhow, that's not Abimelech. And we do have to remember that Abraham, from the very get-go that God called him, was told, God said to Abraham, he says, "I'm going to make you a great nation, and I'm also going to bless you, and I'm going to make your name great." Abraham must be a great name, because here we are still talking about it, 4,000 years later, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse. And in you, Abraham, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And I don't know about you, if you've ever thought about that, but hey, I am the recipient of this blessing that God was talking about that would come through Abraham. I'm not Jewish. I'm not Israeli. I'm just a dumb redneck, from Ireland at some point in time, and from America right now, a rebel, an American rebel, who has been brought to an understanding of God's special revelation. And I say, like Abimelech says, yes, 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 I would like to be blessed. I don't want to be cursed at all. But this is what Abraham needs to learn. And consequently, we need to learn it too. And Abraham, I do think, going from chapter 19, is scared out of his pants over that Sodom and Gomorrah scene. So now's a good time to remind Abraham that God's positivity needs to be the focus here, that God intends to bring his blessing to the world. He's going to hold off judgment as long as he possibly can, but there are going to come moments when, judgment needs to come. And God will judge peoples and nations in a myriad of different ways. He'll use other nations to do that, because God is big like that. He can handle it all. But Abraham must learn to be a blessing. And Abraham probably did curl in his shell after the Sodom and Gomorrah thing. And now, he needs to learn that God's blessers is really the point. And God's blessing is going to spread. And it's going to spread not through some sort of superhuman power, but it's going to spread through flawed human beings like Abraham. God spreads his special revelation of himself through not superhumans, but actually flawed human beings like me and you. This is what makes me fall in love with the Bible and actually, treat with great skepticism anything that the world tries to dole out to me. And then the funnier part in this story is that God is a stickler, and he's even kind of maybe we say didactic or even a bit pedantic when it comes to teaching Abraham to do this, because Abimelech's life is in Abraham's hands, and Abimelech knows that his life is in Abraham's hands. And so Abimelech does all he can to show his blessing towards Abraham, and Abraham does exactly what God wanted him to do. He turns around and blesses. He just simply prays for Abimelech, and Abimelech, is now blessed. And that's really a good definition of a prophet too. Someone who has God's special revelation and simply prays for it and is willing to share that special revelation with others. We can all be prophetic to that extent. And there is a very funny irony in the storyline because, Abimelech's whole household, and I assume this story didn't take place in a day or a day and a half, that this story took place over a little bit of time, and all of Abimelech's house has gone, well, sterile, mind you, that, everybody's wombs have dried up, until this situation is resolved. And part of Abraham praying for Abimelech kind of lifts the healing into place, and all of the sudden those wombs that were closed by the Lord are now opened because, well, Abraham has done what he was supposed to do. He has prayed for Abimelech, and what makes it really ironic is that it was because of Sarah that all these women's wombs were shut. But what makes it funny is Sarah's own womb is shut, and it still isn't opened. And Abraham and Sarah are still being told, you need to keep having sex because I'm going to give you a child. And that's right, in their 90s. They are in their 90s at this point in time, which adds a great funny irony to the whole storyline. So anyhow, everybody's fertility is made good except for Sarah's, and Sarah is still without child. And so that tension's going to linger on. But in this story, Abraham must learn to be a blesser. And in this story of learning how to be a blesser, it goes straight to Jesus' own buddies that teach us, the apostles, the disciples, whatever you want to call them, the guys that Jesus picked to record his life faithfully and his teaching faithfully. Those are the guys that should be like our, historical best friends. So I love what Peter says, because you can just hear everything that Peter says in the tone of what God is teaching Abraham. Peter is teaching us too, which makes the Bible remarkable because it keeps the same pattern of what we need to learn from the beginning to the end. We can learn everything we need to know about our relationship with God right there in Genesis. And Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, says it this way. He says, finally, all of you have, and he's speaking to all of us Christians, have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil, reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called. You see, every person who receives God's special revelation is called to be a blesser. Just like Abraham was called to be a blesser, Christians are called to be blessers. If we decide we're not going to be a blesser, then we're in our own rogue status. It doesn't mean that God gives up on us, but we're on our own. We're doing our own thing. We're not doing God's thing. Peter goes on to, with this quote that comes from a psalm. He says, whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and he hears, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Peter says, now, who is there to harm you if you're zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you'll be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. Have a good conscience, so that when you're slandered, if you are, that those who revile your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. Okay, well that's a great passage that has that whole pattern of learning how to be a blesser in mind. And Peter is telling all of us Christians, we are called to be a blesser. If you really want to be a rebel in this world, be a blesser. Because the sad reality is that if you are consistently blessing other people, the world will try to give you a butt kick at some point in time. And if you're getting your butt kicked because you're a blesser, it's not likely, but it can and does happen. But if it does happen, sleep well and laugh at the world in which we live. But God is calling us, make no mistake, to the same exact calling that he gave to Abraham, and that is to be a blessing. Be the blessing. Be ready, as Peter says. Live your life setting in your own heart Christ as Lord, as holy. And just be ready to tell somebody that sees in you the hope that is in you. And explain it to them. Just say, well, I'm a Christian. I fully dig the storyline of the Bible. I think the answer to life solutions are found in the Bible, in the person of Jesus Christ. I think he's God. I don't know. You don't have to be super clever. Just tell them, you're a Christian. When somebody, when you do good consistently, people will notice, and they will at times even ask you, what is it about your life? And when people get close to your life, they tend to, know that you're a Christian. And if people get close to you and they don't know you're a Christian, well, what's that about? That means you're not taking the role of being a blesser seriously. God calls us to be blessers. And Peter knows it. Abraham knows it. I learned it. You need to learn it. We all need to learn how to be good blessers. And we also have to learn that if we ain't blessing, and if we're not the blesser, we're on our own. Doesn't mean God doesn't love us. He does love us. But be the blesser. That's the lesson. That's the lesson of Abraham. That's the lesson of Jesus to all of us. And that's the wrap for today's talk. Be the blesser. See you next time.